Hi, I'm Kristin Omdahl and welcome back to my studio. In this video, I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for making the beautiful Kayla Mobius Cowl. The Kayla Mobius Cowl is available as a single download pattern or as part of my brand new knitting book, Layers Knit. You will need one ball of Be So Sporty bling yarn to make this project. That's 90% bamboo, 10% pure silver, plied right into the yarn. And you'll also need a US 6 or 4mm set of knitting needles, and you'll need one extra needle for the 3-needle bind off. We're also going to be using a 1 yard of contrast yarn to do a special cast on technique. So let's get started. We'll be using the Provisional Cast On technique for starting this project, and that's so that we can take out the cast on edge and attach those stitches back to a knitting needle to do a 3-needle bind off at the end of this project. So what we want to do is hold our working yarn and our high contrast scrap yarn together in one hand, hold the knitting needle in that same hand, and then in your opposite hand, you want to loop the contrast yarn over your thumb and loop the working yarn over your finger. And you're going to pull the loop, insert the needle into the loop on your thumb and pull the loop on your finger through the loop on your thumb. And then you have your first cast on stitch with the scrap contrast yarn underneath the stitch. So we'll do that again. Scrap yarn is on your thumb, the working yarn is on your finger, and we'll insert our needle into the scrap yarn to pull the working yarn through. For this particular pattern, we need a multiple of 4 plus 1 stitches. So that would be 4 plus 4 plus 4 for as many multiples as you want, and then 1 extra stitch. So if you wanted to make the cowl wider or narrower than the original, you would need to adjust to a different multiple of 4 plus 1. Okay, and so that's what the provisional cast on should look like. Next, I want to show you how to work our stitch pattern. I said that it was a multiple of 4 plus 1, and it's also a repeat of 5 rows. So it's a 5-row repeat, and then you repeat those 5 rows for the entire length of your project. So if you're wanting to change the length of your cowl, make it longer or shorter than the one that I made, you would adjust in multiples of the 5-row pattern. Row 1 of the pattern is to knit 1, then knit the next 2 stitches, pick up the second stitch from the edge and pull it up and over the first to bind it off. Knit the next stitch and then bind off the previous stitch again. Then slip the next stitch purlwise and bind off the previous stitch again. And that's our repeat we're going to do across the row. So let me show it to you one more time. Knit 2 to bind off 1, knit another stitch to bind off 2, then slip the next stitch purlwise and bind off a 3rd stitch. So we'll just repeat that across the row. This is what the end of row 1 should look like, and you may notice that our stitch count has changed. The stitch count is going to be different at the end of each of the 5 rows. So row 2 now begins with a knit 1, yarn over, and knit the next stitch. And that's what we will repeat across the row. Yarn over, knit the next stitch, yarn over, knit the next stitch. And that's what the end of row 2 should look like. Row 3, we're going to knit each stitch across. And what I mean by that is we're going to knit the stitches and knit the yarn overs as stitches as well. That's what the end of row 3 should look like. Row 4, we're going to knit the first stitch. Okay, now we're going to knit into this large space below and before the next stitch. So you insert your knitting needle into the large space, yarn over your needle and pull up. So we've picked up and knit a new stitch, then knit the next 2 stitches. And that's our repeat. So we're going to knit into the yarn over space from 2 rows below and knit the next 2 stitches. Knit into the yarn over space below, knit the next 2 stitches. And we'll repeat this all the way across. This is what the end of row 4 should look like. In row 5, we're going to knit the first stitch. Now we're going to work into that large yarn over space again. So now it's 1 row further below. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to pick up and knit into that large space. So insert your knitting needle, yarn over your needle and pull up a loop. So we've picked up and knit a new stitch into the yarn over space, then knit each of the next 3 stitches. Now, if you ever get hung up in the middle of a large row and you're not sure if you've done enough stitches, you're not sure if you're skewed a little bit and just not at the right place, always remember the end of this repeat ends on the stitch that's over the elongated stitch from the previous repeat. So our repeat again is to knit, pick up and knit into the yarn over space, then knit the next 3. And when I knit that last stitch, it should be the same stitch as the elongated stitch in the previous repeat. And so if you keep that in mind, it really does help you stay on track. And we will just repeat this all the way across. And that's what the end of row 5 should look like. And you want to repeat rows 1 through 5 for the length of your cowl. Next, I'm going to show you how we take our stitches back off of the provisional cast on so that we have live stitches back on a knitting needle. You can definitely use the same size needle as you used for knitting a project like this when you're picking up the stitches from the cast on edge, but you can even go a lot smaller if you need to. Sometimes it's helpful for getting into tight spaces if you use a knitting needle that's just a little smaller than what you would expect it to be. So you see these loops right here? These are the loops that we're going to be picking up. So I'm going to be picking them up individually and pulling the cast on edge, or pulling the contrast yarn out as we go. So I've pulled it out of that first live stitch and I have that live stitch now on my working knitting needle. And so this would be the next stitch right here. So I'll insert it onto the knitting needle and then I'll take the other side of the needle and start pulling my contrast yarn out. So now I have 2 live stitches on my working needle. So now here's our next stitch. So I'll insert that next stitch and then pull out the contrast yarn. And you just want to repeat this all the way across the row. Next, I'll show you how to do the 3 needle bind off and show you how we twist this fabric to make it a Mobius. Okay, so now we have this is the cast on edge. We've pulled out the contrast yarn from the provisional cast on and we've made the stitches live stitches again. So there we have the same number of stitches here as we do at the end of our last row. We worked in that direction. So now what we want to do is join them together to do a 3 needle bind off. But if we pulled them together like this, we would create a tubular cowl. And we want to do a Mobius twist in this first. So we're going to go back to the pattern for a minute. I want you to pay attention to the schematic. There's an A, B, C, and D on here. And so if you think of that in terms of A, B, C, and D. We want, if we were doing a tube, corner A would line up with corner C and B would line up with D, but we want to do it opposite. We want corner B to line up with C and corner A to line up with D. So we're going to do, let's get the needles, let's get the stitches into the middle of the needle. It'll help do this. It'll help get it positioned better. So we want this side to line up with this side here. So we're going to turn it one time and then slide the stitches down to that end. Okay, so we just turned it one time, and now we're going to have a Mobius twist when we do our 3-needle bind off. If you haven't done a 3-needle bind off in a while, it's not that difficult. It's very similar to a regular bind off. We're going to insert our knitting needle into the first stitch on both sides, on both sets of needles, and we're going to knit them together and slide them off. And we're going to add a yarn over in between these stitches just to give it a very loose bind off. So we're going to yarn over, then insert our knitting needle into the next stitch on our front needle and the next stitch on our back needle, knit the two of them together, and you can do this one at a time if it's easier to get it off the needle that way. Okay, and so now we have one stitch, one yarn over, and a second stitch. We're going to pick up the first stitch and the yarn over and pass them up and over the second stitch. So it's the same thing as a lace bind off that we do a lot in a lot of my patterns to give a stretchy edge, but we're adding that second component of a 3-needle bind off at the same time. So let's do that a few more times. Yarn over, insert your needle into the first stitch on the front needle and the back needle, knit the two of them together, slide those stitches off the respective needles. So now we have a knit stitch, a yarn over, and a knit stitch, and we're going to pick up that first knit stitch and the yarn over and pass them over the second stitch. And so now we have another really loose bind off stitch completed with that yarn over in between. Yarn over, insert your knitting needle into the first stitch on the front and first stitch on the back needles, knit them together, slide those stitches off the respective needles, pick up the knit and yarn over, up and over the second knit stitch and off the needle. And you want to repeat this all the way across your row, but don't fasten off at the end. We've finished our seam. Now, if you're intimidated by that 3-needle bind off, don't worry, you can always sew this together as well. So if you just did a regular cast on and a regular bind off on each side of here, you would just sew these together. So if you didn't want to do the 3-needle bind off, it's not really mandatory for this project. So just do whatever feels comfortable for your skill level. So the reason why we're not going to bind off our stitches is because we're going to pick up and knit a beautiful edging around the edge of this. And I'm going to show that to you on the actual cowl now. This is the one that I did in Be So Sporty Bling yarn in colorway Shishoogi Ban. And so because we're picking up and knitting into this large space here, you can't just pick up as many stitches as you want. You either have to pick up and knit, alternate with pick up and purl, or alternate with yarn overs to get multiple stitches into the same space. So for this one, I chose to do the yarn over. So we're going to, so if this stitch lines up over the section of stitches here, so we're going to yarn over, pick up and knit one in the big space, pick up and knit again in the big space, and then pick up and knit into the section that has a body of work to it. So there's a row there to pick up and knit into. So we're going to pick up and knit 4 stitches into the space and 1 into the next section of stitch right here. So it's going to give us a multiple of 5. So I'll show you a couple more repeats. Yarn over, pick up and knit 1 in the big space, yarn over, pick up and knit 1 in the big space again, and then pick up and knit into the next section of stitches. I'll do it one more time without saying anything. Okay, and so you're going to repeat that all the way around. Now, because it's a Mobius twist, you're actually going to be doing the top and bottom edging all at the same time. Isn't that great? So once you come all the way around to the beginning of your round, you'll actually have, okay, so you can see here, because of that Mobius twist, our edging is actually done in one continuous figure 8 loop. So as you're picking up and knitting into the edge, you're coming around and doing it only one time for the entire edge of the whole piece. Then you're going to do a knit and purl combination and bind it off, and you will be done. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions for me, please leave them for me in the comments. And everything we talked about today, from the yarn, the book, the pattern, and everything else, all of those links are listed below in the video description. Let us make time to create, share, and inspire today and every day. I'll see you in the next video.